There are children who learn to be invisible before they learn to be seen. They master the art of silence before they understand the power of their voice. And somewhere in that silence, a part of them dies that will take decades to resurrect. If it ever comes back at all. Introduction. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. A child sitting at the top of the stairs, knees pulled to their chest, listening to the sounds of life happening below. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of dishes, the warmth of connection floating up like smoke from a fire they're not invited to sit beside. They want to go down. God, they want to go down. But something stops them. Not a locked door. Not a spoken rule. Something more insidious. Something that lives in the space between what is said and what is felt. The knowledge, deep and wordless, that their presence doesn't add to the moment, that their arrival would shift the energy from ease to obligation, that they are, at best, tolerated, at worst, a disruption. So they stay at the top of the stairs, learning to be small, learning to be quiet, learning to exist in the margins of other people's lives. This is the ignored child, not beaten, not screamed at, not locked away, just unseen. And in some ways that's worse, because at least overt abuse leaves evidence. It leaves proof. It gives you something to point to and say, this is what happened to me. This is why I hurt. But invisibility? Emotional neglect? Being ignored? It leaves no bruises, no scars you can photograph, no dramatic story you can tell at therapy that makes the therapist lean forward with concern. It just leaves you with this gnawing, inexplicable feeling that something vital was missing from your childhood, that you grew up in a house full of people but somehow raised yourself, that you were alone in a crowd, starving at a table full of food that was never offered to you. And the cruelest part? You can't even blame anyone, because they didn't do anything to you. They just didn't do anything for you either. Part 1. The landscape of neglect. Let me paint you a more detailed picture of what this looks like. The ignored child is the one who comes home from school bursting with something to share. A good grade, a funny story, a question that's been burning in their mind all day. And they walk into the kitchen where their parent is on the phone, or cooking, or scrolling, or just present, but not present. The child hovers, waiting for an opening, for eye contact, for permission to exist in the space. Sometimes they get a distracted without any actual listening. Sometimes they get a "not now, honey," that becomes "not ever." Sometimes they just get ignored entirely, as if they're a ghost haunting their own home. So they learn to stop trying. They learn to keep their stories to themselves, to process their emotions alone in their room, to figure out their homework without help, their social struggles without guidance, their existential questions without a witness. They become self-sufficient out of necessity, not choice. Or maybe the ignored child is the middle child, born into a family where the oldest gets attention for being first, for achieving, for blazing trails. And the youngest gets attention for being the baby, the cute one, the one who still needs protecting, and they're just there, in between. The bridge no one crosses, the name sometimes forgotten when their parent lists their siblings, the face that blurs in family photos because no one thought to make sure they were properly in frame. They don't get help with homework because everyone assumes they're fine. They don't get asked about their day because everyone's too busy with the drama of the other siblings. They don't get taken to their activities with the same enthusiasm Because by the third child, parents are tired. And so they learn that love is a finite resource that's already been claimed by others. That attention is something earned by being more troubled, more talented, more something. And they are just regular, just ordinary, just easy. And easy children get overlooked. Or maybe the ignored child grows up in a home where a parent is depressed, physically present, but emotionally absent, going through the motions of feeding, clothing, housing, but unable to truly see their child, unable to meet them with curiosity, with delight, with genuine interest in who they're becoming. The child looks into their parents' eyes and sees a vacant stare looking past them, through them, at something the child can't see and doesn't understand. The child tries to be good, thinking maybe if they're perfect, they'll pull their parent out of the fog. They try to be funny, thinking maybe laughter will work like medicine. They try to be invisible, thinking maybe their presence is the problem. Nothing works. Because the parent's absence has nothing to do with the child, but the child doesn't know that. The child just knows that no matter what they do, they can't seem to matter enough to be truly noticed. Or maybe the ignored child has parents who are there but consumed by work, by marriage problems, by their own unhealed trauma, by addiction, by caring for another sibling with special needs, by poverty and survival. The parents aren't bad people. They're overwhelmed people, stretched too thin, running on empty. And the child, the healthy, capable, undemanding child, becomes the lowest priority. Not because they're loved less, but because they need less, or seem to need less, or have learned to perform needing less. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and this child learned early not to squeak. Part 2. The adaptation. Here's what happens in the psychology of a child who is chronically ignored. They develop what researchers call an avoidant attachment style. They learn that their needs will not be met, so they stop expressing needs. They learn that their emotions make others uncomfortable, so they stop showing emotions. They learn that seeking connection leads to rejection, so they stop seeking connection. They become precociously independent, self-reliant to a fault. The child who never asks for help. The teenager who figures everything out alone. The adult who can't lean on others because they never learned how. From the outside, they look strong, capable, low maintenance, easy. From the inside, they're collapsing. Starving for attention, they've convinced themselves they don't need. Desperate for connection, they've taught themselves not to want. Carrying a loneliness so profound it becomes part of their identity. Dr. Gabor Mate, the physician and trauma expert, talks about how children have two fundamental needs: attachment and authenticity. The need to belong and the need to be themselves. When these needs conflict, when being yourself threatens belonging, the child will sacrifice authenticity to maintain attachment. Every single time. The ignored child learns that their authentic self is too much, too loud, too needy, too emotional, too present. So they create a false self, a smaller self, a more palatable self. They become the child who doesn't make waves, who doesn't ask questions at bedtime, who doesn't cry when they're hurt, who doesn't interrupt, who doesn't need. They become the ghost in their own life. And here's the devastating part. They often get praised for this. You're so independent. You're such an easy child. I never have to worry about you. They're rewarded for their self-erasure. which teaches them that their value lies in not being a burden, that love is conditional on their ability to not need anything. Part 3. The internal experience. Let me take you inside the mind of the ignored child. Imagine feeling like you're speaking but no one hears you. Like you're drowning but no one sees you thrashing. Like you're in a room full of people who look right through you as if you're made of glass. Imagine the confusion of knowing, logically, that you're fed and clothed and housed, that you have the basics, but feeling this profound emptiness where emotional nourishment should be. Imagine not having the language to explain what's wrong because nothing is obviously wrong. The house isn't on fire. No one is hitting you. You can't point to a specific incident and say, "This is abuse." It's just the accumulation of 1,000 small absences. 1,000 moments of not being seen, not being heard, not being remembered, not being prioritized, not being chosen. Death by 1,000 paper cuts of indifference. The ignored child often develops what psychologists call ambient anxiety, a low-grade, constant worry that they can't quite name or explain. It's the psychological equivalent of waiting for the other shoe to drop, except there's no first shoe. There's just this vague, pervasive sense that something is wrong. What's wrong is that their nervous system is starving for attunement, for someone to notice them, to respond to them, to confirm that they exist and matter. But they don't have the framework to understand that. They just know they feel wrong, anxious, empty, like they're fundamentally broken in a way they can't articulate. They also develop hypervigilance around other people's emotions. Because when you grow up ignored, you become obsessed with trying to understand why. Is mom tired? Is dad stressed? Is my sibling more important? What did I do wrong? What could I do differently to finally be seen? You become a student of other people's emotional states. You learn to read micro-expressions, to detect shifts in mood, to anticipate needs before they're expressed. You become emotionally intelligent about everyone except yourself. Because you've spent your whole childhood focused outward, on figuring out how to matter to people who don't naturally attune to you, that you never learn to attune to yourself. You don't know what you feel, what you need, what you want. You only know how to scan the room and adjust yourself to fit the emotional weather of others. Part 4. The core wounds. The ignored child develops several core wounds that follow them into adulthood. Wound number 1. I am not important. When you grow up being overlooked, you internalize the message that you don't matter. That other people, their needs, their feelings, their schedules, their preferences, are more important than yours. You become the adult who always yields, who never asserts their needs, who apologizes for taking up space, who makes themselves small in every interaction. You become convinced that your importance is determined by your usefulness to others, that your value lies in what you can do for people, not in who you are. Wound number 2. I am alone. Being ignored teaches you that you're fundamentally alone in this world, that no one is coming to save you, that you can't rely on others, that connection is either unavailable or unreliable. You become the adult who doesn't ask for help, who doesn't share their struggles, who suffers in silence because you learned early that your pain doesn't summon support. It just makes you more invisible. You become isolated, not because you want to be, but because isolation feels safer than the risk of reaching out and being ignored again. Wound number 3. Something is wrong with me. Children are egocentric. They believe everything is about them. So when a child is ignored, they don't think, my parent is dealing with their own issues. They think, I must be unworthy of attention. They internalize the neglect as evidence of their inadequacy. They decide that there's something fundamentally wrong with them that makes them invisible, unlovable, forgettable. You become the adult with imposter syndrome, with chronic self-doubt, with the inability to believe anyone could genuinely want you around. You become convinced that if people really knew you, really saw you, they'd understand why you were ignored. Because there's something defective in you that you can't see, but everyone else can. Wound number 4. My needs don't matter. When your needs are chronically unmet and unacknowledged, you learn to stop having them, or at least to stop expressing them. You become the adult who can't identify what they want, who always defers to others, who says, I don't care, or whatever you want, because you genuinely don't have access to your own preferences anymore. You've spent so long suppressing your needs that you've lost the ability to feel them. And when you do feel them, when some need becomes so urgent it breaks through, you feel ashamed, guilty, like you're being unreasonable and demanding just for wanting basic human connection and care. Part 5. The long-term effects. Let's talk about what happens when the ignored child becomes an adult. They often struggle with relationships because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust that your needs will be met. But they have no template for that, no experience of being responded to with consistency and care. So they either avoid intimacy entirely, they stay distant, keep people at arm's length, convince themselves they don't need closeness. They become the friend who's always busy, the partner who can't commit, the family member who lives far away and rarely visits. Or become desperate for intimacy. They latch on to anyone who shows them attention. They mistake basic kindness for deep connection. They overfunction in relationships, trying to earn the love they were denied as children. They tolerate neglect in their adult relationships because it's familiar, and familiar feels like home even when home was painful. They often struggle with their careers, not because they lack talent or intelligence, but because success requires visibility. It requires speaking up, advocating for yourself, believing you deserve recognition. And the ignored child learned to stay small, to not take up space, to not draw attention to themselves. So they become the employee who does excellent work, but never gets promoted because they don't advocate for themselves. The talented artist who never shares their work. The brilliant mind who stays silent in meetings. They sabotage their own success because deep down, they don't believe they deserve to be seen. They often struggle with their mental health. The research is clear. Emotional neglect in childhood is strongly correlated with depression, anxiety, and complex PTSD in adulthood. Because when you grow up feeling invisible, you internalize a profound sense of worthlessness. You carry this nameless grief, mourning for the childhood you deserved but didn't get, for the parent who could have seen you but didn't, for the version of yourself who never got to fully exist because you had to stay hidden to survive. And the cruelest part is that this pain is often dismissed. People say, but you had a roof over your head. You were fed. You weren't abused. And you're left feeling crazy for grieving something so intangible, for hurting over what didn't happen rather than what did. But the absence of love is as damaging as the presence of abuse. Sometimes more so, because at least abuse is definitive. Neglect is ambiguous. It leaves you questioning your own reality. Was it really that bad? Or am I just too sensitive? Too needy? Too much? Part 6. The invisible damage. There's a concept in psychology called developmental trauma. The idea that trauma isn't just about what happens to you, but also about what doesn't happen that should have. The ignored child experiences developmental trauma. Their nervous system develops in an environment of emotional deprivation. Their brain wires itself around the expectation that needs won't be met, that emotions aren't welcome, that they're on their own. This shows up in the body. They might have chronic health issues, autoimmune conditions, digestive problems, chronic pain, because the body keeps the score of emotional neglect, even when the mind tries to minimize it. They might have difficulty regulating their emotions, swinging between numbness and overwhelm, never quite able to find equilibrium. They might have a constant sense of restlessness, of not belonging anywhere, of searching for home in people and places and substances, because they never felt at home in their own family. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his groundbreaking book The Body Keeps the Score, writes about how our earliest relationships literally shape our brains. Children who grow up with consistent, attuned caregiving develop secure attachment and healthy emotional regulation. Children who grow up ignored develop brains that are wired for threat detection, for hypervigilance, for disconnection. Their amygdala, the fear center, becomes overactive. Their prefrontal cortex, the reasoning center, becomes underactive. They exist in a state of chronic stress that they're so accustomed to, they think it's normal. They don't know that other people don't feel anxious all the time, that other people aren't constantly monitoring their environment for signs of rejection, that other people can rest without feeling guilty. They think everyone feels the way they do. That everyone is performing normalcy while secretly feeling fundamentally alone. Part 7. The pattern repetition. Here's where it gets even more painful. The ignored child often recreates their childhood dynamics in adult relationships. Not because they want to, but because familiar patterns feel like home, even when home was painful. They find partners who are emotionally unavailable, who are inconsistent with attention, who make them feel like they have to work for love. They find friends who take but don't give, who remember them when they need something but forget them otherwise. They find jobs where they're undervalued and overlooked, and they stay. Because this dynamic, the dynamic of not quite mattering enough, is the only version of love they know. They mistake breadcrumbs for a feast. They're grateful for the bare minimum because the bare minimum is more than they got as children. They don't realize they're starving because they've been starving for so long. They think this is what fullness feels like. Carl Jung wrote about the concept of repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate unresolved childhood wounds in adult relationships, hoping that this time we'll get it right. This time we'll finally be seen. This time we'll finally matter enough. But we never choose partners who are capable of seeing us. We choose partners who replicate the original wound, because our unconscious is trying to master the past, to rewrite the script, and it never works. Because you can't heal your relationship with your parent by finding someone just like them and hoping for a different outcome. You just end up ignored all over again, except now you've done it to yourself. Part 8. the awakening. But here's what can happen. Sometimes the ignored child grows up. Sometimes they find a therapist, a book, a relationship, a moment of clarity that cracks something open inside them. Sometimes they realize, I wasn't the problem. The neglect wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a failure of the people who were supposed to care for me. This realization is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it means grieving. Grieving the childhood you deserved. Grieving the parent who couldn't show up for you. Grieving all the years you spent believing you were unworthy when the truth was, you were just unseen. But liberating, because it means you can stop trying to earn your right to exist. You can stop performing. You can stop making yourself small. You can start the slow, painful, beautiful work of learning to take up space. This awakening doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single moment of clarity followed by permanent healing. It's a gradual process, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Days where you feel powerful in your right to exist, followed by days where you shrink back into old patterns. It's learning to notice when you're making yourself invisible and choosing differently. It's practicing saying what you need, even when your body screams that you're being too much. It's staying in relationships where you're actually seen and letting the discomfort of being visible become familiar. It's grieving. God, so much grieving. For the child you were. For the needs that went unmet. For the person you might have been if you'd been cherished instead of overlooked. Part 9. The reparenting. Healing from being the ignored child requires what therapists call reparenting. Becoming for yourself the parent you needed but didn't have. This means noticing yourself. Truly noticing. Checking in with your own feelings the way a loving parent checks in with a child. How am I feeling today? What do I need? What would feel good right now? This means responding to yourself with compassion. When you make a mistake, when you struggle, when you have a need. Meeting yourself with kindness instead of shame. This means celebrating yourself, your wins, your growth, your mere existence. Because you deserve to be celebrated as a child, and since no one did it then, you can do it now. This means setting boundaries. Saying no to relationships and situations where you're treated as an afterthought. Refusing to accept breadcrumbs. Demanding to be prioritized. This means taking up space, speaking up in meetings, sharing your work, asking for what you need. Existing boldly and unapologetically even when every cell in your body tells you to shrink. It's uncomfortable. It feels wrong. It triggers every old belief about being too much, too needy, too visible. But discomfort isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. Sometimes discomfort is a sign you're doing something right, something new, something that contradicts the old programming. You have to be willing to feel uncomfortable, to feel selfish, to feel like you're taking up too much space. Because that discomfort is the gap between who you were taught to be and who you actually are. And on the other side of that discomfort is freedom. Part 10. The truth. Here's what I need you to know if you were the ignored child. You deserved better. You deserved to be seen, to be delighted in, to be the center of someone's world, at least for moments, at least sometimes. You deserved parents who noticed you, who asked about your day and actually listened to the answer, who remembered your interests and encouraged your passions. Who saw you struggling and offered help before you had to beg for it? You deserve to have your needs met without having to earn it. without having to be perfect or invisible or convenient. You deserve to be loved for who you were, not for how little trouble you caused. And the fact that you didn't get that, that's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of your caregiver's capacity. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe they were dealing with their own unhealed trauma. Maybe they didn't know how to see you because no one ever saw them. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain, but it does redirect it. The problem wasn't you. It never was. You weren't too much or too little or too anything. You were a child who needed to be seen, and you had caregivers who couldn't do that. That's the tragedy. Not that you were defective, but that they were limited. Part 11. The Reclamation. So what now? Now you get to decide who you become. You're not destined to be invisible forever. You're not condemned to replay this pattern for the rest of your life. You have a choice. A hard choice, but a choice nonetheless. You can continue to shrink, to hide, to make yourself small in the hope that someone might finally notice you. To accept less than you deserve because it's familiar. Or you can choose to be seen, even when it's terrifying, even when it triggers every old fear, even when your nervous system screams that visibility equals danger. You can choose to show up fully, to speak your truth, to share your gifts, to exist at full volume. You can choose relationships where you're prioritized, where your needs matter, where you don't have to earn basic respect and attention. You can choose to believe, even when you don't feel it yet, that you matter, that your existence has value, that the world is better with you in it, visible and present. This isn't about becoming loud or aggressive or demanding. It's not about overcompensating for years of invisibility by forcing yourself into the spotlight. It's about finding your natural size. The amount of space you'd take up if you hadn't spent your whole life contracting. It's about discovering who you are when you're not performing smallness, when you're not monitoring everyone else's comfort, when you're just yourself. That version of you is still in there. The child who wanted to be seen before they learned it wasn't safe. Before they decided invisibility was easier. They're waiting for you to remember them, to reclaim them, to let them exist again. Conclusion. The inheritance. If you were the ignored child, you inherited something difficult. The knowledge that love is not guaranteed. That presence is not the same as connection. That you can be surrounded by people and still be profoundly alone. But you also inherited something powerful. The ability to see other people's invisibility. To notice the ones being overlooked. To extend to others the recognition you never received. You became someone who pays attention, who notices the quiet ones, who remembers details about people that they've mentioned only once, who makes others feel seen because you know what it's like to be invisible. That's not nothing. That's a kind of superpower born from pain. But you don't have to keep suffering for that gift to matter. You can heal your own wounds while still holding space for others. You can learn to see yourself the way you see others, with compassion, with attention, with the recognition that every human being deserves to be noticed. You can break the cycle. You can refuse to pass this wound to the next generation. You can become the person who sees their own children, their partners, their friends with the kind of presence you longed for. You can transform your pain into purpose without martyring yourself in the process. The ignored child grew up believing they didn't matter. But the ignored child was wrong. You matter. You always mattered. Your needs are valid. Your feelings are real. Your existence requires no justification. You don't need to earn your place in the room. You don't need to be useful or convenient or low maintenance to deserve love. You deserve to be seen simply because you're here. And if no one saw you then, I see you now. You are not invisible. You are not forgettable. You are not too much or too little. You are exactly enough. You always were. And your story, this story of growing up unseen, is not your ending. It's just your beginning. The part where you learn to see yourself. The part where you reclaim your right to exist fully. The part where you finally become visible. Not to them, to yourself. And that changes everything.